Hey everyone, it's Mr. Drake. If you are one of my students, I have instructed you to watch this video because we did not get through the Jackson lecture in class. We did get through some of it, namely the spoils system and the Indian Removal Act and all of its after effects. So if you're some random stranger watching this video, please don't throw anything into the comments like, you didn't even talk about Indian removal. I did, but not here. So what we're going to do with this video is go over the rest of the highlights from Jackson's administration. I, of course, encourage you to read your book for more details on a lot of this stuff. But like the lectures do in class, this will hit the high notes. So with that in mind, here we go. At the time of Jackson's election, the second party system hadn't really begun in earnest yet, but there was a lot of partisan divide, especially with matters of economics, which is the first two things we're going to talk about in this video. The first is the Nullification Crisis of the early 1830s, which found its origins in the 1828 protective tariff passed by Congress. This was one of the highest tariffs in American history, and of course a tariff is a tax on imports. I think you're probably aware of that. The tariff of 1828 was designed to protect northern businesses from foreign competition, but it really hurt the South because it hampered their trade with England. The South's main economic lifeline was the trade of cotton and other cash crops with European nations, and this really hampered that. And they began to refer to this tariff as the tariff of abominations. The leader in opposing this tariff was the Vice President of the United States, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, whose crazy picture you see there. And the Southerners were really railing against this tariff and began to bring up those ideas that Jefferson and Madison had advocated in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, namely the theory of nullification, that if a law was deemed unconstitutional by a state, they could declare that law null and void within their own borders. And there began to be rumblings in southern states, especially South Carolina, about nullifying the tariff of 1828. Of course, this is awkward because Calhoun is Jackson's vice president, so they have very different views on this. And there's a yearly celebration back then by the Democrats to celebrate Thomas Jefferson's birthday, and all of the leaders at this party would offer a toast. And Andrew Jackson offered a toast that said, "Our Union, it must be preserved," because everyone up to this point thought that Jackson might side with Calhoun. Jackson's a Southerner, he's the president of the common man and all that, and he basically, just throws the gauntlet down right there and says, we're not going to have any kind of separation or disunion over this. Calhoun's response, sort of cowed at the time, was the Union next to our liberties most dear. So you still see that disagreement between the two. Jackson reduced the tariff rates in 1832. The tariff was still in place, but not as bad as it was. That didn't appease Calhoun's faction, who led a convention that nullified the tariff of 1832 and the tariff of abominations. And Calhoun sort of passes that and then waits to see what Jackson would do. I don't think he expected the strong reaction that Jackson had, which was the Force Bill. Jackson signs what's called the Force Bill in 1833 that says that the federal government had the right to basically go into South Carolina and enforce the tariff by force if necessary. They closed the custom houses in Charleston and Georgetown, the main ports in South Carolina, replaced them with federal ships in the harbor to make sure the tariff was being collected and all the customs were being enforced. And Jackson basically said that if any blood was spilled over this issue, that he was personally going to go into South Carolina and start hanging people. And he alluded to the fact that he would start with John C. Calhoun. With the Force Bill and Jackson's hardline stance against these whispers of nullification, not really whispers, it was really more shouts, the crisis ended. South Carolina backs down. And this is an interesting case because Jackson is the president of the common man, and he does favor states' rights, but not at the expense of federal authority. And so he asserts strong federal, jurisdiction over tariffs here, despite what he may personally believe about the power of the government. Another battle Jackson found himself in the early 1830s centered around the Bank of the United States, or just shortened to the National Bank. The first national bank was chartered in 1791 by Hamilton, you may recall, and its charter expired in 1811. And part of what made the War of 1812 so difficult for the U.S. is that they were fighting the war without a national bank to back up the nation's finances. And after the War of 1812, era of good feelings, everyone's patriotic, there's not that much partisan bickering and all of that, the Bank of the United States was rechartered as part of the internal improvements proposed by people like Henry Clay to make the nation's financial system stronger. The recharter was for 20 years. So it was to expire in 1836. In 1832, Henry Clay, who was running against Andrew Jackson for the presidency, these two really, really hated each other, by the way. Clay convinced the president of the National Bank, Nicholas Biddle, whose picture you see there, to go ahead and try to renew the bank's charter early to get a second 20-year charter for the bank to exist and operate. And the reason Clay did this is he was hoping that Jackson, who hated the bank, would say something stupid or something regrettable during the campaign about the bank that Clay could then turn around and use against him in the election. So this was quite the power play by Henry Clay, but it didn't work. When the charter went before Congress, it passed. It then went to Andrew Jackson for him to sign into law to recharter it. And instead of making any speeches or going after Clay personally, Jackson simply vetoes the recharter of the bank, saying the bank was dangerous to democracy and too beholden to its stockholders. The National Bank was actually not really run by the government. It was a private corporation that operated with the government's permission, but it had stockholders, like the First National Bank had and like the Bank of England operated, and it was financed by wealthy merchants and financiers, mostly from the North, which is part of the reason that Jackson didn't like it. So the recharter of the bank is struck down, is vetoed. Jackson doesn't want to wait until 1836 for the bank to die, though. So what he starts doing is authorizing the Secretary of the Treasury, Roger B. Taney, to withdraw funds from the bank and basically just bleeds the bank out over the period of a couple of years. And within a year or two, the Bank of the U.S. Was dead. Jackson saw this as a victory for the common man over the wealthy financiers who would favor Northerners over Southerners, favor the wealthy over the poor. And he called it that monster bank and said, the bank is trying to kill me, well, I will kill it. And he really kind of made it a personal war against Nicholas Biddle, who had been speaking out against Jackson in the press. But this is just another instance, again, of Jackson trying to assert himself as being the president of the common man. All of this heavy-handed action by Jackson, Indian removal, the forced bill, the bank war, leads to some more galvanized opposition against him, and it leads to the rise of the Whig Party in the 1830s. The Whigs were simply opposed to Andrew Jackson and his policies. In Great Britain, the Whig Party is the party that opposed the king. Okay, so this sort of shows you that they viewed Jackson as a king, as you see there in a famous cartoon about King Andrew I, stepping on the bank charter and all of that. The leaders of the Whig Party were Daniel Webster, who was a northern senator who was very, very pro-national bank, and then also Henry Clay, who was tired of seeing his American system of internal improvements in a national bank, just harassed over and over again by Jackson and his policies. The Whig Party has one major problem, though. It's geographically diverse. You've got Northerners like Daniel Webster, who's from Massachusetts, and you've got Westerners like Clay, who's from Kentucky. John C. Calhoun, after he leaves the vice presidency, after Jackson threatened to hang him, he ends up joining the Whig Party. He's from the South, so you've got Northern, Southern, Western, the most geographically diverse political party in the first few decades of America's history. This was good and bad. They get some widespread support, but at the same time, they still have some pretty different beliefs on a lot of stuff. You've got people who are for internal improvements, people who are against internal improvements. You've got pro-tariff, anti-tariff. The only thing they had in common was they hated Jackson. That was the one tie that bound. And so when it came time to pick candidates, for instance, you're going to see a lot of fighting inside the party. The first appearance of a Whig on the presidential ballot happens in 1836. Martin Van Buren of New York was Jackson's vice president after Calhoun for Jackson's second term, and he was fairly popular. He was, Jackson's main guy, basically. The Whigs knew that they couldn't beat Jackson, or beat Van Buren, rather, straight up. So what they decided to do was divide and conquer. They thought that if they could run 3 different candidates, they could maybe divide up the vote enough among 4 people to where the election would have to be decided by the House. So they ran a Northern Whig, a Southern Whig, and a Western Whig, and it almost worked, but Van Buren came out on top. Side note, the Northern Whig in the 1836 election was William Henry Harrison, who would win the presidency 4 years later. Not long after Van Buren takes office, the economy collapses. The Panic of 1837 was a 5-year-long recession. Was pretty bad, probably worse than the Panic of 1819, which occurred during Monroe's presidency when all of the industry and shipping and trading that had been, fostered by the War of 1812 kind of slowed down in peacetime. The Panic of 1837 was caused by several different factors. The main one really was probably the lack of a national bank. So Van Buren ends up kind of reaping what Andrew Jackson sowed in getting rid of the national bank. There was also speculation on lands in the West where people were paying for land that they really couldn't afford, and with paper currency that wasn't worth a whole lot, that kind of thing. This really hurts Van Buren and leads to his defeat in 1840. Van Buren becomes known as Van Ruin in Whig political cartoons. The idea was that he's like sitting in his plush White House in Washington, D.C. while everyone else is starving, and the Whigs really kind of played that up. The Whigs this time managed to unite behind one candidate. They probably united behind the wrong one, as it turns out, but William Henry Harrison was a national hero after the Battle of Tippecanoe before the War of 1812. Fighting against the Indians out west. He's portrayed as the common man, much as Jackson was. One of the slogans that his campaign used was log cabins and hard cider. The idea that William Henry Harrison's this normal guy who sits on the porch of his log cabin and drinks and is a manly man. Of course, William Henry Harrison is loaded, wealthy, and that's not exactly accurate, but politicians do that all the time, trying to play themselves up as the common folk. Because the Whigs don't have a lot of broad support across regions. Harrison's a Northerner. They needed to get a Southerner on the ticket to make it attractive, so they picked John Tyler, who was from Virginia, who really wasn't even a Whig. He's pretty much just a Democrat. He was a big states' rights guy and didn't agree with much of anything with William Henry Harrison. They were very, very different. The mistake the Whigs make here is running Harrison. I mean, they don't know he's going to die after 30 days, obviously, which he does, which ends up making Tyler the president, who's not a Whig at all. The Whigs later on refer to John Tyler as his accidency. If they'd known that Harrison was going to keel over, they never would have picked John Tyler, and they probably wouldn't have picked Harrison, too. Fact of the matter is, everything was so bad in 1840 with the Panic of 1837 and the economic ruin that people were facing that the Whigs could have run anybody, and they would have beaten Van Buren. And if they'd known that, they probably would have run Henry Clay, the guy who runs for president like 48 times and never wins. But they went with Harrison, and the rest is history. That'll do it for today. If you have any questions, make sure you ask, and make sure to keep up with your reading as we get through this unit. Cheers.